Next start.
Yep. Shoot.
Okay. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are very glad to start a conversation with our Canadian colleagues who helped us with our focus program this year. And our colleagues are Tom Ernst, Mullen, and Jason Gorber. And every one of them are presenting and making interviews with Ukrainian filmmakers, with Kyiv Critics, Oleg Sentsov, and Miroslav Latek, which will be, the screen will be tomorrow. And what are we going to talk about tonight? What we thought would be interesting for any audience, actually, and something that we have in common in Ukraine and Canada. And what actually struck us is that both Ukraine and Canada have their cinemas, have their films, and being present nearby bigger player. So the major one, which influences the region, for example, if we talk about Russia, it's a very influential country, a very influential cinema country in the region, and being United States, which is the main cinema of the world, for example, yes? And what I think is very interesting to discuss is how do we survive? How do we cope? How do we develop in the shade of this neighborhood? And what I wanted actually to start with is to ask Tom, Pat, and Jason, when we started our selection process, you said that one of the most interesting, or maybe the most important question is to distinguish who are the Canadian directors and which film should we consider Canadian. Is Dune by Denis Villeneuve a Canadian film? So how do you answer this question? How do you?
I'll start. I can dance around that. We are a unique thing here in Canada, obviously, because we have this dominant culture to our south, especially for our English language cinema. I happened to be in Montreal this week, and in Quebec, in the French language part of Canada, they've done an extraordinary job, both for political and aesthetic reasons, of delineating between not only American, sort of the hegemony, the big American cinema, but also between French cinema. They've created essentially a national cinema in a region of the country, and have done so for decades. And Denis Villeneuve absolutely is the son of that. Many of his early films came directly out of the city. There's many Anglo films that come directly out of the Montreal. So there's a school here in Quebec, which is very different than most of the rest of Canada. We have very regional cinema in Atlantic Canada, in the West, obviously in the sort of Toronto, which is the big population area, we have stuff. But I think you're absolutely right. What counts as Canadian cinema is a very big Canadian discussion. We have films where Canadians go to the United States and make big budget films with Hollywood producers, and those are not considered Canadian, even if it's a Canadian director. Forget co-productions, not that at all, but something like, for example, again, Denis Villeneuve, when he did Prisoners, that was an American film. The same year he did Enemy, and that was Prisoners was an American film, and Enemy was a Canadian film. And it had less to do with who made the film, or what the film was about, or where the film was set, but where the money came from, who the producers were. All these checkbox things that are outside the scope of the film. So as audience members, when we say, I want to see a terrific Canadian film, it is different than I want to see a terrific film by a Canadian director. There's lots of Polish directors that work in France. There's some famous ones that are very controversial. Is it a French film if he makes it, or is it a Polish film he makes it? you guys are dealing with very much more complicated circumstances with what counts as Ukrainian. Can a Russian language film be a Ukrainian film? These are the things that we don't necessarily fight with, but we can have an English language film, both English language, both made by directors who are from Canada. One is Canadian, one is American. And that's sort of our unique complication of being next door to a very complicated and big country.
Well, this is actually, you're back. Sorry.
Well, I think one thing too that's really changing the question of what is Canadian film is how much Canada has become involved in co-production. Even this year, our Oscar submission, Drunken Birds, is a co-production with Mexico. It stars a Mexican actor who is in Roma. It partly takes place in Mexico. And, you know, we're seeing this in a lot of films. And I think the idea of what is a Canadian film is changing too, in that, you know, we're a multicultural country. So we're having filmmakers from very different backgrounds telling stories from around the world that still resonate with Canadians who might have lived a similar experience. And, you know, we had that really successful turning point in around 2010, 2012, where Ace on D, Monsieur Lazare, and War Witch were all Oscar nominated. But they were all films that were either set outside Canada, or mostly outside Canada, or told stories about immigrant experiences. And they were really sort of using film to change the way we actually considered what it means to be Canadian. I think we've really tried to expand the worldview of Canadian cinema from just, you know, sort of people in Toronto and Montreal. Like, we're getting just a fuller picture. And I think that's very complicated just for the size of the country. If I see even a film shot in Vancouver, it doesn't necessarily speak to me as a Canadian because I've never been to Vancouver and I don't really know anyone there. So it's very complicated, I think, just with the size, scope, and broad set of experiences that people are engaging with through film.
You know, I agree with a lot what Pat said. We have so many new Canadians and a lot of Canadians with the immigrant experiences. Directors like Albert Chin took us outside of Canada for one of his better known films. And it's no longer about identifying as a Torontonian, as Pat said, or as perhaps as Jason suggested, a Quebecois and being Quebec. East Coast, West Coast, it's such a large country. And unlike the States, where the stories are all very central and a sense of patriotism is there, and it kind of unites their storytelling, regardless of where they came from. They're united as Americans. In Canada, I believe we're less, thankfully, less patriotic. And the whole idea of a Canadian culture and a Canadian identity has always been up in arms. You know, are we closer to the American, or are we closer to the Commonwealth? And hopefully we're neither. We're a mix of all these things. We're one of the countries on this side of the ocean that actually recognizes that we weren't the first ones here. You know, and we're doing that really strongly now with our recognition of Indigenous cinema and Indigenous storytelling. If anything, that's becoming the strongest voice in what could be called Canadian cinema. Other than that, it's storytelling from unique points of views, from unique districts, whether it's East Coast, whether it's West Coast, or whether it's Central Canada. And as Jason pointed out, the Quebecois cinema, French Canadian cinema, is a unique entity all on its own and incredibly successful. And they will refer to themselves as Quebecois cinema, French Canadian cinema, before they'll refer to themselves as Canadian cinema. And it's understandable. They have the language and the culture to sort of unify them. Whereas, you know, the rest of us kind of are all over the place. So I think what's happening now is that we're trying to, we've let go of the idea that we could find a unified voice to identify us. And we are now looking at ways to tell stories like anybody else would tell a story. That they tend to be bleak is more to do with our budget than anything else, and maybe climate. But they range from political to horror movies we're very good at, and documentaries.
I just want to jump in very briefly. Excellent points from my colleagues. The central metaphor for the United States traditionally has been the melting pot, like a borscht. Like you put everything into a pot, you mix it around, and that's what becomes American. That basically you come there and it's all one soup. And at our best, and it's a metaphor, but the Canadian experience is meant to be a mosaic. That it is all one picture, but it's made up of individual pieces, where we keep sort of our individual identities, our cultures, where we came from, what we aspire to, but we sort of collectively form a single picture. That single picture has been challenged for decades. It never really existed, but if we have an aspiration, that's what it is. And I think Pat and Tom are absolutely right. We have a complicated history of ourselves beside all these dominant cultures, be it France, England, or the United States, of what defines us, about what actually sort of captivates us. I will say that we don't have as strong outside of French Canada a real draw to see something because it is Canadian. We do that in music all the time. You get a Drake or a Justin Bieber or something like that, or Celine Dion, and people get excited because they're Canadian. And in cinema, there's a small number that do, but mostly people, and if you go to the box office or you come to the Toronto International Film Festival or something like that, you get this expectation that the entire country is so embracing of our Canadian artists. And really, unfortunately, it's a relatively small group of people that really engage in some of those Canadian artists cinematically. When you go to the multiplex, it's big Hollywood movies. Vast numbers are big dominant films. So more people will see Denis Villeneuve in a Warner Brothers film like Dune, working on that, than they will something like some of his more independent stuff that he did in Quebec. That's just the thing. That David Cronenberg will open a film here and people just won't go in big numbers. We do not celebrate as much as sometimes we should collectively our cinematic expression, except in Quebec, where they really have that they become celebrities out of these little indie auteur directors. And so many of them, Jean-Marc Vallée, so many of these directors have come out of this environment here and exploded onto the world stage because of the nurturing they got here. Hopefully the rest of the country is getting a bit better of lifting up these voices, not the regular voices, but lots and lots of voices, lots of diversity, lots of different stories to tell. And from there, we're hopefully seeing a new resurgence of a broader Canadian cinema. And I think you're seeing that with some of the selections we provided, or at least encourage you guys to see.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Jason. You said that this Quebec was, film industry, they become successful at Quebec and then emerge into the world cinema. So they are becoming, they became successful in box office too?
Let's step back. French culture, French, is the most cinephilic country in the world. So more people go to movies in France per capita than anywhere on the planet. So you have in Quebec this industry that both gets national funding and major provincial funding, the regional funding, to facilitate everything from genre films, action films, whatever, to very straight up art films. And there's a direct conduit between the Quebec cinema and the European cinema, the Belgians, the Switzerlands, but especially the French. And so you have, again, not to get too inside the weeds here, when you go to the Cannes Film Festival, you have all these countries that have pavilions, right? There's the Russian pavilion, the Ukrainian pavilion, the American pavilion, there's a Canadian pavilion, and there's a Quebec pavilion. These are two buildings. Here, the provincial government building is called the National Assembly, we have very much this conflict between this part which is so fundamental to the Canadian character and so fundamental to Canadian cinema, and yet it sometimes sees itself as completely separate from the rest of Canada. So we are dealing, as you are in Ukraine, with different regions and different areas, but ours is very much tied to a history where France was never fully defeated, if that makes any sense, that this was an area that England and France were at. France was subdued in this culture, but never completely eliminated for the better. It's given us everything that's great about this country in many ways, but it has resulted in this tension. And for years, this tension has existed. So as I said, every country is complicated, but Canada, which seems very pacifist and very, kind, we have all these inner tensions, and our best films deal with these inner tensions.
Actually, today we screened Nadia Butterfly film, and there was many themes and many scenes in which this tension is obvious. Nadia, she's Quebecois, and she's never said I'm a Canadian. She have troubles to say I'm a Canadian. She's always says I'm from Quebec. I don't sing Canadian anthem, and so on. So this is it was obvious in the very films we screened this year. So yeah.
Yeah, and actually I haven't seen in a while such a movie where like two languages were switched every minute or like every couple of seconds, like 30 seconds you've got English, then you got French, then again English. So you can clearly see this tension even like in communication between the characters, and the way they are asking, like, can you please talk in English because I don't understand French, and so on and so on. So yeah, it was actually very interesting to hear what you're going to say about this thing, about like two parts, like two aspects of Canadian cinema, and how it actually can be transformed and showed in a movie.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the role of language has really been what's allowed Quebec to establish sort of a second national cinema within a cinema, because the way the rest of Canada is competing with Hollywood, Quebec, Hollywood films will be dubbed usually by actors from France in Quebec. So then there's still a nuance of language that gets lost in translation, whereas Quebecois films are speaking a language that relates to people in Quebec. They're in franglais, they use different vernacular, and I think they've just help people see their language and culture reflected in a way that just gets lost in translation when a Hollywood film plays. So it's interesting. We do get a lot of films in franglais, and there was a while about 15 years ago where they would release some films in French and English. There was a Bon Cop, Bad Cop that tried to make a film that was directly about the language barrier. It was about it was sort of like The Kid Detective, in a way that it was like a genre comedy where someone was murdered on the Quebec-Ontario border, and then there were all these divides between language and culture and whatnot. And it sort of didn't really connect with people because, I mean, it actually won Best Picture, but was sort of a weird film in that I think it played differently in Quebec than it did in Ontario, because people are more used to this like interchangeable French and English in everyday language, versus most people in Toronto can't speak a word of French, so it gets lost.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about languages because I live in a bilingual household where both my wife and daughter are fluent in French, and I'm not. But I was thinking about Bocop because that movie did have kind of a commercial success. It's not a film that worked for me, oddly enough, but it did sort of pique interest, I think, among French speakers outside of Quebec. But again, just the French speakers. That whole divide didn't quite catch on, as Pat said. There's just such a unique culture that is happening in Quebec cinema, and it even applies in sports. So that's why a film like Les Boys did so well in Quebec. And again, I tried to show it here to English language audiences, and it just didn't fly. Maybe it was because it's about hockey, and there's just some divides that you can't get people to meet on, that being the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. The fans will never agree to walk that divide. But there are so many films that I think that try to cross over. Philippe Farados's films, I think, does a very good job. Jason mentioned a few directors that have, of course, Villeneuve and thank you. All these guys, Denis Arcand, they managed to do it. And there are far more French Canadian directors or Quebecois directors that are able to cross over into Ontario and out west than I think in the reverse.
I don't want to
English-speaking directors.
Yeah, or bilingual, but we're starting to work in English. I'll just say this, and this is very clear. We are both from countries where borders are complicated. We have the longest peaceful border on the planet.
Yeah.
On our south, but like all borders, it's invisible. The difference between Canada and the United States, if you're Anglo, is next to nothing. We grow up with American, not only American television, but American news, American children's program, everything. Everything is absolutely, it's an invisible border in some way. Our borders east to west are actually slightly more firm. My division between me being in Toronto and somebody growing up in Montreal, let alone Quebec City, which is almost entirely Francophone, is much stronger in a funny way than me to New York City or me to Chicago. And so all of these borders get very complicated just in terms of politics, but they equally get complicated in terms of the art that we tell and what films we are telling. This is even more complicated when it is nothing but a story. What it is to be Canadian is a relatively new story that is constantly being written. We talk about Quebecois cinema and we think specifically about Catholic, white, French cinema. Mm-hmm. There's extraordinary Indigenous cinema. There's extraordinary things. And so you have people who are a minority within a majority who themselves have a complicated relationship with the other minority, which is the Indigenous community. So we have all of these nested things about what it counts. And if there's one thing that counts to be Canadian, it's for us to be very too polite, to not recognize the problems, to not actually engage with this stuff. And some of the most exciting cinema of ours is about this, about that you have a very sort of superficial level of calm and underneath is turmoil. David Cronenberg being the most glorious exemplar of that. But so we have now, with this new generation of filmmakers, really trying hard to explore that. And finally, we didn't talk about it for the films we did, but we have a very, very rich history of documentary and animation. These are two films that have come out of this country. And in both of those, you can tell a very different and unique story that's local, but will speak with its locality to a larger thing. And then you're not competing in those spaces necessarily with the big, broad Hollywood. Finally, I know I'm saying a lot. We are invisible for the Americans. So many American TV shows come to Canada, movies come to Canada and pretend to be American. We can pass as American. We can pass as Chicago. We can pass as Vancouver is where X-Files is. Toronto is where so many films play. Montreal all the time. And so what counts as Canadian when we can be thought of as just American? This is even more complicated. And so many films, in a good way, are dealing with this complication that I know absolutely echoes with what does it mean to be Ukrainian? This is very much interesting to me as well.
Well, I think this is a question that is also very debatable now. And it's like, for the last 7 years, I think it's the process of finding this new identity or reinvent the identity. So now there is, for example, a big discussion whether to call the announcement of the independence of 1991 or restatement of the independence. So there is a new discussion about that. And I think I'm actually looking forward for some filmmaker to reflect on that, because for me there is a lack of such cinema. But I think that, and my colleagues I think will add about which films do we consider Ukrainian. I think that the figure of the director and his or her nationality and citizenship is a crucial one, because Ukraine does not take part in major co-productions. It's not a major, doesn't give a major part in the co-production if the director is not Ukrainian, for now, for example. And that's why, but there was, I think, there were some discussions whether to consider some films Ukrainian if there were a minor co-production. And some people actually did, and I don't think that's actually true. It's to consider a film by an Italian director who chose Ukraine by chance, actually got here some money, and to consider this film a Ukrainian one. So I think it's so a national question is very important here. Maybe.
Yeah, and actually it can be crucial when you're even talking about some film made by Ukrainian director, but if it was made somehow in Russia, it can be a problem. It's like, can be a big problem to discuss if it's really an Ukrainian film, because maybe nowadays some producers will consider not to, I don't know, not to broadcast any information about where it was shot, or if it was shot in Russia, not to really broadcast in somewhere to a Ukrainian audience. So it's like the thing we had with Serhii Ksaverov. I don't know if it's like even worth mentioning now, because I think like everyone is already discussed it. So it was some time when we were actually trying to figure out if he's a Russian director, or if he's like an Ukrainian director, or maybe like even, I think he was born in Belarus, right?
Right.
Yeah,
So,
and he lives in Germany.
Yeah, and he have German citizenship, and it was actually the time when he was like just emerged at Cannes Film Festival, and he was like Cannes darling, and we were so proud because of this director we have, and so we were like, it was a very important question to discuss and to figure out. Yeah, and then it was just like, I mean, it's not easiest topic to talk about when it comes to Ukrainian-Russian dynamic, even in cinema. So maybe like with the different countries, like the others, like with Poland, I don't know, or any others like France, or some co-production, minor co-production we have. It's not that crucial as it's with Russia right now. So,
and I also wanted to add, for example, to what Anya said about languages, about switching languages. So in Ukrainian films, there are some Ukrainian films that use that as a
feature. Yeah.
Yes. For example, I don't know if you noticed, but in Rhino, so the main character's gang is Ukrainian language gang, and the gang that they are fighting with are Russian language.
Yeah, so they just like,
so there is some dynamics.
Yeah, the language.
The languages are different, and although Oleg does not, he said yesterday that it is not a political film, but for me, I see this as a political. Every film is political, okay, but he obviously maybe he doesn't care about it, but still, I find it a political statement there. So, in his film, for example.
Again, I'm sorry to jump in on this, but I think this is very crucial. One of the things that I got out of that film is I think that film is both incredibly Ukrainian and incredibly universal, which for me is what makes it a great film. Is that film is so specific about a very specific time, place, culture, people, that it could not have been made anywhere else. but it is not only for those in that environment, like some sort of insulated tiny thing. It speaks to the world. It is meant to showcase the specificity, the actuality of the event, but also be universal in its message and its tone. And for me, this is what breaks apart. These borders are borders that we have constructed. That's when I talk about the invisible border. We're in a country which is much, much more complicated, and matters of life and death, the way it is not for us. We have the liberty to worry about these nuances of culture, but we don't have tanks rolling in or entire parts of our country being taken away or reclaimed, whichever way you're going to sort of discuss that. So it is typical of Canada. I always say about Canada, and I think Pat and Tom will agree, our highs are not as high and our lows are not as low. We sort of are like this. If you go to the United States, the rich are crazy rich and the poor are crazy poor. We're sort of a little bit this. So even our political debates are strong and strident and this, but we're a little bit more moderate is sort of a weak word, but you understand what I'm saying. We are a little bit more nuanced about this.
Well, I think too, it comes from the past 4 to 5 years where we were always like, well, it's not as bad as the USA with Trump. So we're all recovering from that.
Like as bad as it gets for us, it's never so bad. And so it's interesting for us to see all the challenges and warmth and wonderful and craziness and all the stuff that we see taking place in, frankly, former Soviet republics is very complicated and is dealing with a history that, as complicated as our history is nothing near as dramatic, cinematically dramatic as what we went through. Our 1990s were not so good either. I lived through those, but I promise you, it was much worse in Ukraine, more complicated. So this is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely, and this has been a problem since I started seeing films in the 60s. And as we went, we didn't have a Vietnam War to make movies about coming home and all these political films. Easy Rider, we didn't have the divide of the bike riders and the Southern police. So yeah, our stories are always been tempered by the fact that we're just, and I think moderate is a very good choice of words, Jason. It's just sort of a moderate political view that doesn't go to too many extremes. Now we're seeing a little more tension, perhaps even a lot more tension, with the revelation of what's going on with our Indigenous community, and that our history is not as peaceful and not as untainted as we thought it was. In fact, it's quite bleak and it's quite horrifying. And so now we're getting Indigenous voices telling extreme stories. In a lot of cases, those stories are told, I don't know if it's funding or anything, but movies that we're celebrating like Beans, etc., to me is really a better message in the film and a better story than what the film actually is capable of telling us. But it's a rise of voices coming out of there. And similarly, to a lesser extent, the East Coast too, which is a community that is not as wealthy in generally as the rest of Canada, and their voices are starting to surface. So without the conflicts, and thank God we don't have them, I'm not envious of anybody's conflict, but without the conflicts, our storytelling is limited to either reproductions of what we think the problems are or what we think those extremes are. And it may be why we are good in horror films, is because we have to let the imagination go. We have to strive for something outside our own box. Jason.
Tom's point is critical, and because we are on the outside, we have the entire people in comedy that have done extremely well of coming from here. Because again, we see things slightly from the outside, but close enough to see what's going on. So some of the major comedy stars for decades have come out of our culture. Our ability to see, especially dominant American culture, with just enough distance, but just enough connection. And I'm well aware that you guys can look at the other powers around you with a sense of distance and a sense of understanding in a more complicated way because of the hostilities, because of everything going on. But because we ostensibly, as I said, we know way more about America, United States, than the United States has any clue about Canada. They see us as this weird thing up north where we say sorry a lot and we say out and about in this weird accent. But we see them with a certain level of detachment, which on one level, as Tom says, gives us a sense of false superiority, as if we are better than them, as if their problems are not our problems because they're distant. That's the sort of negative, sort of chauvinistic way of seeing it. But the positive way is that we have enough clarity, enough distance, but enough empathy as well, that we can see and engage with what's going on politically, socially, morally, that when a Black Lives Matter protest happens in the United States, it is very much part of the discussion that takes place in our country as well. This is not the, we're supporting them. This is, let us look at ourselves in the mirror and let us look at our own circumstances and how they're similar and how they're different. Sometimes those similarities and differences are erased, which is a problem. Sometimes they are glossed over, which is a problem. But all of these things somehow, and where it comes to cinema, is sometimes the best films don't try to be Canadian. They just are filmed. They are just films that are very local, just like Rhino, that are very local and can be very specific, but they are meant to speak. And the worst Canadian films, by far the worst, English language Canadian films, are those that try to be like medicine, that try somehow to define the undefinable. Canada is made up of either Indigenous or people who have come from somewhere else. We all are stories. And to try to make a single story of that is itself a story. It's an ambition. It's a lie, or it's a beautiful story we tell themselves, whichever way you want to look at it. And I think our cinema is at its best when just try to make a damn good film. And we've made some extraordinary films in this country and we continue to do so. The worst are though when they say, this is a Canadian film, and then it gets super, super prescriptive, like medicine, and that's not good.
Mm-hmm. When you need to take a dose of Canadian cinema as part of your sort of cultural appreciation, then it fails miserably. But absolutely, and if I may piggyback on that, it's also when we look to this, to the south of us and say, well, we got to compete with that. We've got to sort of come up to that level. We do not have to. Some films that I wouldn't show to my family because I just know they wouldn't appreciate. Like I always get the mileage and at 13,000 feet or something like that. That's it, isn't it? And at 13,000 feet. Yeah. I love that movie, but I wouldn't expect my 80-year-old, 85-year-old aunt to appreciate that movie. But for me, that's a simple story. It reminds me of a woman on the verge of a breakdown. Sorry, the John Cassavetes.
Woman Under the Influence.
Woman Under the Influence. It's such a. It reminds me of that movie, and it feels like that movie. That movie's not trying to be the Canadian identity. It's not trying to win the box office that weekend. Neither is a lot of the films that we actually pass along to you, but they're winning films nonetheless. And I will say that one of the exceptions that sort of worked as a commercial and artistic film is the one that Jason introduced to you. And I don't know what's going on. I need another coffee or something. Blood Quantum. That actually works on so many levels. It's a political film, it's a horror film, and it's a fun film. But when you ask the director if that's a political film, if it's a play on an old John Ford movie, you go, no, it's not. And to me, it just seems obvious that it is. But I think it just goes back to what Jason said, and he said it far simpler and more eloquent than I am. That when you just try to make a good movie and a good story, it works. We have great storytellers in this country. We have great filmmakers. And apparently our reputation is for having the best film crews in the world. So put all those together and Just don't try to win the box office. We won't do it.
I'm going to ask my Ukrainian colleagues whether you've seen Wayne's World.
Wayne's World?
Yeah.
Of course, 2 parts. Yeah.
Right.
Both parts.
The most Canadian film perhaps ever made, but set in the United States. So Wayne's World uses Stan Mikita donuts instead of Tim Hortons donuts, who's a different Toronto Maple Leaf or different hockey player. It's set in Aurora, Illinois, instead of Aurora, Ontario, which is a suburb north of Toronto. So Mike Myers, who is from the eastern part of Toronto, took this character who's absolutely fundamentally stereotypically Canadian of my generation. I went to high school with everybody that was like Wayne and Garth. That was it. We drove in Gremlins and shook our hair and listened to Queen. This is what we did. This is a documentary about Canadians in the late 80s and early 90s, but was presented as a Hollywood film. Penelope Spheris directing. This is what you have, is you have Canadian culture infecting, in a funny way, Hollywood. And so does anybody hold that up as this is the greatest Canadian film of all time? No, of course not. But we watch it and we see it all. And we see with that certain sense of distance and it's the same thing. It is much less important to most of us because it is not life and death. Is if somebody thinks I'm American instead of being Canadian, it's only a problem when I'm in Europe. If I'm in New York and they think I'm from New York, it's not a problem. And again, this is very complicated. When I travel in Europe, all of my American friends would put Canadian flags on their bags. So they would pretend they see the border as invisible and they pretend to be Canadian because nobody's going to question them. This happens all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This would never happen. When World Cup happens, suddenly everybody who's Portuguese thinks they're Brazilian, but nobody Brazilian is going to think they're Portuguese, right? We all have these stories that we deal with. And our cinema in so many ways is that we as critics sometimes put boxes around them. And mostly, I'm like, make a good movie. I want it to be a good movie. And when I first saw Rhino, I knew none of this. I purposely went into Rhino knowing nothing about the director, the star, the story, where it came. I'm like, show me a movie. I saw a movie, it moved me. Then I dug in. Then I scratched at the surface. And it becomes more extraordinary the more you know. But I did not go in with the, not baggage, that sounds negative, but with the background. And it still worked. That's what I mean. The great cinema will still work, whether or not it is in the box that you wish to showcase. And this, for me, is the greatest of cinema.
Actually, I wanted to say about Blood Quantum the same you said, Jason, about the Rhino. It's very local. It's very stories that it is rooted, yeah, into, I don't know, a very specific location, I think. But the story itself is very universal.
Well, especially after COVID. It is a film about the plague.
Yeah.
And now we globally have this COVID, right? We share in a funny way that borders mean nothing. That in some ways, that this really are stories, that whoever you are, this will happen to us. Stories will infect us, things will infect us at its best. And it's important for us to hold on to our identities, but it's also important for not to let the identities dictate and keep things away that maybe don't speak to us directly. And this, for me, is super, super important.
Pat, were you trying to get in there?
I was.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to Blood Quantum and when you mentioned John Ford,
Yes.
because it doesn't reference John Ford, but Jeff Barnaby's style and story is very much rooted in cinematic influences from probably Canada's most significant filmmaker, Alanis Obomsawin, who makes documentaries. And a lot of the audience doesn't recognize what Jeff is referencing just because audiences don't watch as many documentaries as they should.
Yeah.
But the story, there are shots, I mean, it's in the same locale as Alanis's films, like Incident at Rusty Gooch and Kanishitake, 270 Years of Resistance, which is the same story that was retold in Beans. And I think there's sort of been a long overdue reappraisal of Alanis's work this year. Like for the first time, the Toronto International Film Festival celebrated her in a major retrospective. But for a filmmaker who's 89 and has made over 50 films, she hasn't really been celebrated in the way that John Ford would be, or
Yes.
Denis Villeneuve, David Cronenberg. And I think it's seeing this new generation of voices like Jeff Barnaby, like Tracy Deer, whose work directly reflects Alanis's influence. And I think if you know the films they're referencing, it just makes them that much more exciting. And so I hope that these films are encouraging a lot of people to go back and visit the archives and see some older Canadian films that they've missed.
And I don't want to put you guys in a tough spot, but I'm watching a film like Donbass in the south of France. I want to know how a film like that plays for you guys. How does that complicated film about histories and complicated and what's truth and what's not truth and all that, how does a film like that seen as through Ukrainian eyes?
Before my colleagues will start to answer, I'm so sorry, I have to be running to my screening, so I just, not to interrupt you, please continue, but I'm going now. Bye.
Bye, Anna.
Thank you.
Donbass.
So you want to know specifically about the Donbass?
What we think about Donbass? Okay.
I want to know how it was responded, because I was there in France where it was seen in the one particular lens. I am curious again how you guys saw it locally and how it was responded to.
I think I don't know whether you know it or not, but Serhii Ksaverov obviously made this movie on the very large amount of YouTube material, of video material, documentary. Yeah, so. But for me, it was not like a reportage. It was not from like documentary from the war zone. It was something that only Loznitsa wanted to say. And it coincided with all of his works. They about this chaos underneath it all. Yeah, and the war, how scary it may sound, is a beautiful topic for such a director like Loznitsa. Gives him opportunity to talk about his chaos in every human being. So I didn't think much of its authenticity. Yeah, like I thought of it like of Loznitsa films. The same actually about Rhino, but I think Rhino, it's like, it's like a window into the 90s. I think this film don't reflect on 90s. It like shows 90s, and that's all.
And the reason I asked this is I think both of these films, I think they are absolutely connected in a funny way. I think this is one of the dangers, is that when you're on the outside, you have the liberty to just take it as a film. I believe strongly that we have to take these movies as just movies on some level. The most political, the most harrowing, the most shocking film has to move you in some way. Entertain is too weak a word, but it has to affect you. And I think I can watch something like Donbass with the ability, the privilege of not having to deal with the questions you have to deal with. I can ask sort of philosophical questions about truth, about history, about how stories are told and all of this stuff, but I don't have to get up in the morning worrying my government is going to be shaped by what this film does or doesn't. I don't have to worry about whether I lived through a period where my leader was lying to me on a regular basis in a way that caused wars. So this is what I'm saying is, from an outsider, we can experience these films just as a series of movies. And sometimes this is good, but sometimes I think it's more complicated when you're living there. And this is where is the film Ukrainian, is the film Canadian is different. Because what it is to be a Ukrainian film, I think, is a much more complicated and much stronger conflict, because what it is to be Canadian is itself already. Remember, it's everything's modulated. We're already like, oh, it's not a Canadian film, okay? Not a Canadian film, whatever, okay? but in other words, there's nothing for us to really clung onto because it's not existential for us. It's not life or death in some ways for us.
Well,
it is for many people.
I just wanted to say that for me, Donbass is a film of an from the outside, you know.
Yes,
so,
it is.
This is like a film that made by in a head of a very reasonable and very thoughtful and very skillful director. But this is film from outside.
Would the director see himself as being on the outside?
Yes, he thinks that's his actually his theme, and he tries to say something like he is an insider. He tries to provide some insights on Ukraine, whether Ukraine does well, whether we are coping with our difficult lives. But the thing that he's from the outside is actually plays against him, and that's the film. My thing with Donbass is that, so I watched it in Cannes, and I think we were maybe in the same
sitting
room,
beside each other.
Yes, maybe we didn't. I tried to watch it like with your eyes, for example. Well, it was very difficult to do, obviously, and I wrote actually a very strange review, which was very emotional, and because I could not like estrange myself from the reality I live in, and so the cinema of Leznica is not about human beings; it's about the territory and the crowds and people's different. So that's what Badior, for example, is about. And Jason, I'm maybe we will share another Zoom call, because I'm actually very excited to know what you think about the film. But returning to Donbass, and I think the main thing that it does, it dehumanizes the region, because Donbass is the region where the war is. And one of the reasons the war started is the dehumanizing of people that live there. And Leznica continues to do that. And I was furious about that. And I think that his method failed there completely. Because
here's what I'm getting at.
Empathy.
Please forgive Pat and Tom. This is a very specific thing that I'm getting at. For us, it's still, if that film was about Canada and was made in Canada, about something in Canada, essentially, it would be a Canadian film. And so we don't have the ability in some ways to distance that, to parse that line, to say this is an outsider, this isn't really Ukrainian. Do you understand what I mean? This is where our histories of what our country is and what our cinema is different. Because we are a storytelling place from everybody. Everybody's an outsider by that definition. And therefore, unless you're Indigenous, you're not a Canadian filmmaker, and even that gets complicated, right? So for me, the collision of this about other people coming in from outside telling your stories, it's very complicated in Eastern Europe in a way that in Canada, we just have different complications. We have different stories. Anyway, thank you. We could go on about this, but this is that's why I was very interested. What counts as Ukrainian is different than what counts as Canadian.
It is a Ukrainian film still. Donbass is a Ukrainian film. It was shot in Ukraine, has a Ukrainian crew, has Ukrainian money. Leznica thinks of himself as a Ukrainian director. Okay, well, Ukrainian actors. It's a Ukrainian film, shot from the outside point of view, which is okay, which is fine. Still, it is, yeah.
I wanted to say maybe I've been not quite clear. I think I like Leznica, and I like Donbass actually. I think it's a good movie, and I think it is good that he is he's like has an outside view, because it gives him opportunity to analyze us. Yeah, you can't analyze yourself, you know, and that gives him an interesting point of view. But it has another thing going on, because I don't think of Loznitsa's films as a matter of life and death. Oleg Sentsov is another story. Yeah, it's a matter of life and death for me, but not Loznitsa's film, which are good for my taste. Yeah.
Again, we don't have so many life and death. We do in the Indigenous cinema. Are true stories of life and death.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about Indigenous cinema. About maybe 10 years ago, I watched a beautiful film. I don't remember its Indigenous name. It was in Inuit language. It was, in English, it was Fast Runner.
Yeah.
Antanarjuat. So that's a film that Pat can speak very eloquent, so can Tom. I know they both work with Zacharias Knut, but the film's called Antanarjuat.
Yeah, and I love this movie, but this is, it was, I think, shot with the Inuit crew. I think there was an Inuit director.
Zacharias Knut, yeah.
Yeah, and it was beautiful 3-hour or so film, but it was essentially epic traditional story.
Yeah.
Now this year in the selection you gave us, it was about 10 films. Yeah, there was, I think, 3 of them about indigenous stories of today, and how are they and how these communities indigenous connected or isolated or conflict with the I don't know, this mainstream community or patchwork of mainstream communities. It is very interesting. Yeah, it was obvious from the first film, from the Blood Quantum, and I thought, oh, something is changing.
Yep. Yeah. Go ahead, Pat.
No, go ahead.
Well,
that's Canada right there.
Well, I was just thinking, Pat has spoken the least of us, and I would love to hear what Pat has to say. And if there's time, I'll add my bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I do think, you know, a lot of Canadian cinema comes in waves, and I think we're really seeing a new wave of Indigenous cinema, and part of that has been that one thing to emerge from the Truth and Reconciliation hearing committee was the development of an Indigenous Screen Office. So we have a funding system that's now working specifically to create Indigenous films. So those films will be coming down the line. But there are a lot of exciting Indigenous filmmakers working today. Mostly they're in documentary. And I think just because there has been such a problematic history of filmmaking in Canada by outsiders making documentaries about Indigenous communities and lives, that documentary has sort of been the first step towards people getting the cameras in their hands to tell stories about their communities from their own point of view. And probably the more successful ones recently would have been Tasha Hubbard's Niba Mr. We Will Stand Up, which was about sort of a young man who was murdered by a white man just because he drove onto his farm. And this year, one of the more popular films on the festival circuit is The Meaning of Empathy by Elmaya Tailfeathers, who was the lead actress in Blood Quantum. And so she's looking at the opioid crisis and how her mother is one of the doctors on the front lines treating people. So really, I think Indigenous cinema has largely been rooted in documentary. And actually, Zacharias Knut's background at Isuma before making Atanarjuat was in documentary. So that's where sort of the direct cinema approach of Tanarjuat really comes through. And so I think, you know, sort of as Canadian film is developing, it's really seeing how a lot of people with documentary roots are translating a sense of realism into their stories and really creating these authentic portraits of life that are rooted in history, and even taking them into something completely crazy like Blood Quantum. And it's, you know, a genre film, but it still stings like everyday life.
Yeah.
So I think, Tom, maybe you'd want to.
Well, yeah, I think this leads nicely what I wanted to say is that, yeah, the voices, the Indigenous filmmakers' voices are now starting to be heard, and their stories starting to be told. And I think they come from a long tradition of great documentary filmmakers. And you mentioned Abomswin, who is probably one of the greatest documentary filmmakers, regardless of her Indigenous background. She's just a fantastic documentary filmmaker. And by the way, an incredible woman. And just a side story, interviewing her on stage at a film she was doing at a festival. And I had to she asked me to cut it short because she was rushing off to a set to make her next film. And she was like 87 back then. So, but there's something else that's going on within our Indigenous community. And that is many of them grew up on Hollywood films, and many of them grew up on Hollywood films like John Ford, and I'll throw back to John Ford, and which is why when Jeff Barnaby tells me, no, there's no Ford Apache or John Ford in this, I go, there is, Jeff, you're just not admitting it. But they're retelling the stories that they heard and grew up on through Indigenous eyes. So now we have in Blood Quantum a fort being held by Indigenous people, keeping white people out. And then what happens when they let one white person in? They bring a blanket in that's disease-ridden, or perhaps disease-ridden. Well, that's what wiped out a lot of Indigenous communities in the first place.
That's why I said that this story is universal. It's universal not only on human level, it's universal on a cinematic level. Yeah, because it's Fordians.
So, Serhii, just very briefly, Tanarjuat owes a lot to specific documentary and Massanuttaq of the North. We talk about films that are sort of inadvertently Canadian. The first documentary isn't really a documentary. It is a documentary in the sense that it documents something, but what it did was hired a bunch of Inuits to go up and recreate things that they hadn't done in 80 years. So the first non-fiction film itself was a fiction, which is very complicated.
Yeah, that's funny.
But Tanarjuat does something which, in terms of global appreciation, does something that works in very many countries. I think of Germany specifically, that absolutely fetishize Indigenous historical stories and do not appreciate necessarily Indigenous contemporary stories. So things like Fast Runner are beloved in a way because they tell a story that's thought of as distinct, whereas contemporary stories that deal with real problems that really continue are thought of, no, that's a bastion for a different community. And you have a whole bunch of filmmakers saying, no, this is our story, this is our truth. So yes, Fast Runner, I'm taking nothing away from Fast Runner. It's considered by many the greatest Canadian film of all time. When TIFF did their list of top Canadian films of all time, it was #1. That film is considered a masterpiece. The challenges for that filmmaker and the challenges for that style is to go from something that works on an absolute, it's like Star Wars, it's Joseph Campbell, it's this myth-making, grand historical thing. The vision of that man running on the ice with his bloody feet is one of the great scenes in cinematic history. But how do you do that to speak to a contemporary audience? Sometimes that's a challenge. And one way they do it, and one way world cinema is doing it, is to take genre film, to take horror films, zombie movies, action films, gangster films like Rhino, and you have a hook. You have something that can sell. It's like, I don't give a damn about what's going on in 1990s Ukraine, but I'm going to watch this film about a gangster. And then when watching it, you're going to get more out of it. And this is what has excited me for 25 years that I've been doing it is I have seen an explosion. Everybody looks at the 1970s and say, why were these films so good? Because these films dealt with deep psychology and politics and all those other elements, but did so in a genre element.
Absolutely. I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to jump in, Jason, because I know we're going to get cut off soon, and I wanted to get this one point in.
Please.
Because I agree with absolutely everything Jason and Pat have been saying. The one thing I wanted to take a big giant leap back and talk about authenticity in cinema. I find that if you really want to tell an authentic story, you lie. You know, you make things up, because that is the best way. If you try to take a biographical film and make it let's see, like a Queen, Freddie Mercury or something, it's going to fail, I think. But if you do make something up and create something and tell stories as if it's a parable, like Blood Quantum, the message is going to hit. You may not know that you got hit with the message, but it's going to be there. That's it for me.
I think it was the greatest ending of all Zoom discussions of all time. Thank you guys for this conversation, and I hope this is not the last one. I hope we will see each other soon, and I hope it will be in live
person.
In person.
You have one job now. When you see movies you love, you let us know, and we'll do the same. Okay, we will continue.
Yeah, okay? Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you for being with us, and
yeah, thanks.
bye.
Okay.
It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.